Hi there. This is chapter 6 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So in this chapter there's more travel through the Dakotas. There's a brief exploration or a further exploration of Chris, now that everyone knows what's up, and also of John's inability to relate to motorcycle maintenance. We learn a little bit more about the mysterious Phaedrus. We go into more depth about the classic romantic split, and in so doing begin to enter Phaedrus's world. We also explore how systems are divided up and analyzed, and in doing that introduce the concept of the analytic knife with a demonstration, and begin to discuss how Phaedrus uses it. So chapter 6 begins with the first sign possibly of some kind of Zen or Eastern practice. I walk out of the pines onto a stretch of barren sand between some grass and watch for a long time, meditatively. Also in this chapter, it looks like we're going to start to get to know Phaedrus. I've decided today's Chautauqua will begin to explore Phaedrus's world. It was intended earlier simply to restate some of his ideas that relate to technology and human values, and make no reference to him personally, but the pattern of thought and memory that occurred last night has indicated this is not the way to go. To omit him now would be to run from something that should not be run from. In the first gray of morning, what Chris said about his Indian friend's grandmother came back to me, clearing something up. She said ghosts appear when someone has not been buried right. That's true. He was never buried right, and that's exactly the source of trouble. So here's a line that gets me tripped up every time. They're cooking breakfast. We get a fire started while Sylvia opens up packages of bacon and eggs and bread for breakfast. So I get hung up on this every time I read it. It confuses me. How can she carry around eggs on the motorcycle? I guess they mean powdered eggs, but I've got a cognitive block here. I can't get over how she's transporting this stuff, especially in the heat. Remember how hot it was. I suppose the bacon will keep in the heat. I'm not sure why, but I just really wish I knew exactly how these food items were processed, packaged, and transported, because, you know, it's quite a long time ago, and it's going to be very different, I guess. To wake Chris up, the narrator tosses him out of his sleeping bag, which, since we were just talking about parenting style and we were talking about some of Chris's psychological challenges, this is a little disconcerting. And Chris comes to breakfast and won't eat because of one of his stomach aches, so you kind of have to wonder there. We finish breakfast silently, and I'm oddly tranquil. The decision about Phaedrus may have something to do with it. The narrator does a little motorcycle maintenance, and John continues to be perplexed by this. How did you know how to do that, he asks. You just have to figure it out. I wouldn't know where to start, he says. I think to myself, that's the problem, all right. Where to start? To reach him, you have to back up, and the further back you go, the further back you see you have to go, until what looked like a small problem of communication turns into a major philosophic inquiry. That, I suppose, is why the Chautauqua. He's worth reaching, though. So with that, we begin to enter the mysterious Phaedrus's world. After all, says the narrator, it's Phaedrus's ideas that inform the Chautauqua. Now I want to begin to fulfill a certain obligation by stating that there was one person, no longer here, who had something to say, and who said it, but whom no one believed or really understood, forgotten. For reasons that will become apparent, I'd prefer that he remain forgotten, but there's no choice other than to reopen his case. I don't know his whole story, no one ever will, except Phaedrus himself, and he can no longer speak. So if you haven't read this before, this is really mysterious. The purpose of the enlargement is not to argue for him, certainly not to praise him. The purpose is to bury him forever. For whatever reason, the narrator is not at all happy about whoever this Phaedrus is emerging hither and yon, but he feels like he owes him something major. And to do so, to pay this debt, he must enter his world and let him have his say. So we enter through the continuing exploration of a particular dichotomy. At least it gets more articulated here. We will be entering Phaedrus's world, the only world he ever knew, in which all understanding is in terms of underlying form. The world of underlying form is an unusual object of discussion because it is actually a mode of discussion itself. You discuss things in terms of their immediate appearance, or you discuss them in terms of their underlying form. So to go forward in this discussion, says the narrator, this dichotomy, though not ideal, is necessary. I want to divide human understanding into two kinds, classical understanding and romantic understanding. A classic understanding sees the world primarily as underlying form itself. A romantic understanding sees it primarily in terms of immediate appearance. If you were to show an engine or mechanical drawing or an electronic schematic to a romantic, it is unlikely he would see much of interest in it. It has no appeal because the reality he sees is its surface. Dull, complex lists of names, lines, and numbers. Nothing interesting. But if you were to show the same blueprint or schematic, or give the same description to a classical person, he might look at it and then become fascinated by it because he sees that within the lines and shapes and symbols is a tremendous richness of underlying form. The romantic mode is primarily inspirational, imaginative, creative, intuitive. Feelings rather than facts predominate. Art, when it is opposed to science, is often romantic. It does not proceed by reason or by laws. It proceeds by feeling, intuition, and aesthetic conscience. The classic mode, by contrast, proceeds by reason and by laws, which are themselves underlying forms of thought and behavior. The classical style is straightforward, unadorned, unemotional, economical, and carefully proportioned. Its purpose is not to inspire emotionally, but to bring order out of chaos and make the unknown known. It is aesthetically restrained. Everything is under control. Its value is measured in terms of the skill with which this control is maintained. Naturally, the romantic sees this as total overkill, that it's anal. Everything's got to be measured and proved, oppressive, heavy, endlessly gray, the death force. To the classic understanding, the romantic is frivolous, irrational, erratic, untrustworthy, interested primarily in pleasure-seeking, shallow, of no substance, often a parasite who cannot or will not carry his own weight, a real drag on society. By now, these battle lines should sound a little familiar, and they do. They sound familiar in terms of temperament, but especially these days in terms of political sides. This is the source of the trouble. Persons tend to think and feel exclusively in one mode or the other, and in doing so tend to misunderstand and underestimate what the other mode is all about. Now, doesn't that feel just like what's going on now? It is within this context that Phaedrus thought what Phaedrus thought and said is significant, but no one was listening at the time, and they only thought him eccentric at first, then undesirable, then slightly mad, and then genuinely insane. In Phaedrus's case, there was a court-ordered police arrest and permanent removal from society. Again, for the first-time reader, this mystery of Phaedrus is starting to heat up. Who is this madman who is so dangerous that he had to be locked up, but so brilliant that he is heavily informing the thinking of the narrator? So thinking of Phaedrus, making this resolve to go into Phaedrus's world, pleases the narrator. The traffic is heavy now. I'm just as happy to be thinking about the rational, analytical, classical world of Phaedrus. His kind of rationality has been used since antiquity to remove oneself from the tedium and depression of one's immediate surroundings. So that's interesting. Think of when you are bored. What is one thing you are very likely to do? Well, you're very likely to start noticing and analyzing what's going on around you. Excuse me. It's almost natural. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you get curious and fixated, and you've triggered that seeking system that we talked about before, that seeking system that when it's triggered, you go into the flow state, and you are very satisfied, at peace, positive emotion. And to give a fuller description of what this is, I want now to turn his analytic approach back on itself, to analyze analysis itself. I want to do this first of all by giving an extensive example of it, and then by dissecting what it is. The motorcycle is a perfect subject, since the motorcycle itself was invented by classic minds. So what follows is a rational analysis of the motorcycle. I guess like he says, by dissection. And this is how he phrases what he's going to do. A motorcycle may be divided for purposes of classical rational analysis by means of its component assemblies and by means of its functions. So he proceeds to go through these divisions and then the functional divisions and why they make sense. And this goes on for some time. And he goes through the descriptions of the component and functional assemblies, and you get to hear a lot about the motorcycle parts and how they fit together and work, which is rather interesting if you don't know anything about it. It's a little perplexing, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the purpose here isn't exhaustively to analyze the motorcycle. It's to provide a starting point, an example of a mode of understanding of things, which will certainly become an object of analysis. There's certainly nothing strange about this description. It sounds like something from a beginning textbook on the subject. What's unusual about it is that when it ceases to be a mode of discourse and becomes an object of discourse, then certain things can be pointed to. So besides the fact that to describe something like this is somewhat boring in a textbook fashion, there are 4 things to notice. The first thing to notice is the motorcycle, as described, is almost impossible to understand unless you already know how one works. The immediate surface impressions that are essential for primary understanding are gone. Only the underlying form is left. The second point is the observer is missing. There's no real subjects, only objects exist. And they exist kind of in this ether where there isn't anyone to be engaged with them. So there's strictly things in the environment. The third is that there is no value judgment here. There's no good and bad. Only facts are presented. And the fourth point is important to the overall trajectory of Phaedrus' philosophical quest. It is that of the knife. The fourth is that there is a knife moving here, a very deadly one, an intellectual scalpel so swift and so sharp, you sometimes don't see it moving. You get the illusion that all those parts are just there and being named as they exist. But they can be named quite differently and organized quite differently depending on how the knife moves. And what this means is divisions in general, you could even say, are somewhat arbitrary, as different people and different mechanics and manufacturers will divide the cycle in different ways. This dividing up of the cycle is an example of how that analytical knife works. And what the narrator says is you really can't look at what the knife's doing. You have to concentrate on the knife itself and how it's doing what it does. And really think about this. Think about categorizations and how much trouble you can get into when your set of categories don't fit with another person's. And this happens all the time. Phaedrus was a master of this knife, and he used it with dexterity and a sense of power. With a single stroke of analytic thought, he split the whole world into parts of his own choosing, split the parts and split the fragments of the parts, finer and finer and finer, until he had reduced it to what he wanted it to be. Even the special use of the terms classic and romantic are examples of his knifemanship. But if this was all there were to him, analytic skill, I would be more willing to shut up about it. What makes it important not to shut up about it is that he used this skill in such a bizarre and yet meaningful way. No one ever saw this. I don't think he even saw it himself. And it may be an illusion of my own, but the knife he used was less that of an assassin than of a poor surgeon. Perhaps there's no difference, but he saw a sick and ailing thing happening, and he started cutting deeper and deeper to get at the root of it. He was after something. That is important. But he was after something, and he used the knife because it was the only tool he had. But he took on so much and went so far. In the end, the real victim was himself. Intriguing, and this is a great supplement to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's the guidebook by Ron DeSanto and Tom Steele, and this came out, I think, in the 90s. And so I'm going to read a section from there because this book is going to help you if you don't know philosophy very well, which I don't, but you know I'm rapidly learning, this book will help you understand this section. So I'm going to not also be the original thinker, can take these thought products, compare them with others, and say that they pertain to this or that compartment, and that they represent this or that category within the compartment. And you see this a lot in journalism, that that people take these talking points and they kind of manipulate them around in various ways, and whoever can manipulate them the cleverest way can get the most viewers, can get the most clicks. The person who can take these parcels of information and manipulate you in an affective sense, and they don't actually have to have any. They don't have to have any experience of what they're talking about. They're a compartmentalizer. So this is really important. You might look at this section with its compartments and contents as a sort of intellectual menu. A menu can list and describe various food offerings in ways that are both informative and tantalizing, but the menu itself is not the meal, and the menu cannot guarantee that the food will be tasty, digestible, and nourishing. So remember, Alan Watts always said, you can't eat the menu. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next Sunday for Chapter 7.